couple of days ago, I put out a community post, and I asked you to ask for book recommendations. So basically, I said, give me some kind of specific, but not too specific requests for books, and I will try to give you a book recommendation based on that. The response was actually really, really good. I probably got about 75 requests, and I'm not able to answer them all. Luckily, there is some overlap, but if I wasn't able to get to yours, I do apologize, and maybe in a future video, I can help you out, because I think this is a series that I could continue going into the future. I also did give priority to two people who are paid supporters of the YouTube channel and podcast. If you go to theclassicalmind.com, you can support us for $5 a month, and I just made sure to give it to them as a way of saying thank you for supporting this project. Okay, so first up, we have a request from Avi Moses, and Avi writes, I love books with extremely different character points of view that enrich each other's perspectives through their differences, like A Song of Ice and Fire, or As I Lay Dying, or Hurricane Season. Now, there are actually two sorts of books that are mentioned here, right? We have a kind of literary fiction with As I Lay Dying, and then we have genre fiction, like we have a fantasy series with A Song of Ice and Fire, otherwise known to a lot of people as Game of Thrones. Let me talk about the fantasy series first. If you like multiple perspective fantasy series, and you like to see conflicting points of view, and you like to see the same scene sometimes from different perspectives, or at least the reflections of those characters from those perspectives, you should read Wheel of Time. Wheel of Time is probably my favorite long fantasy series, defining a long fantasy series as anything that is over 3 books. Wheel of Time is great. I love Wheel of Time. It is sometimes a bit too long. It is certainly could have been shorter. It does have flaws, and there are many criticisms, and I'm not going to rehash them now. But it is a great series. One of the strengths of Robert Jordan, though, the author of The Wheel of Time, is really getting into the heads of a variety of characters and seeing their different motivations and their different reactions to important events. A real classic, though, is probably to read Much Ado About Nothing by William Shakespeare, the play. The whole premise of the play is actually about how different people can walk away from the same event with very different impressions. I always think it's good to read more Shakespeare. We should all become a little bit more familiar with his writing and his work, especially just given the massive impact it's had on the English language. And so I would say if you're looking for those, Wheel of Time for your fantasy stuff, and then Much Ado About Nothing for more on the literary side of things. Bruce Harrison asked how to get started with Russian literature. This one's a little less specific, but luckily there's lots of things to say. The obvious recommendation that you would hear from me is that you should read Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Crime and Punishment is a perfect book. Dostoevsky is one of the great writers, point blank. You don't even have to say one of the great Russian writers. He just is one of the great writers. But everyone who has watched my other videos would know that I would say that. Of course, Dostoevsky is just one of the two big names when you think of Russian literature. Another would be Tolstoy. I would say if you want to read Tolstoy and you don't want to go into War and Peace, for instance, The Death of Ivan Ilyich is probably the book that I would recommend as kind of a more gentle introduction. It's very, very short. It's very readable. I read it in high school for like a project. And it's and it has stuck with me to this day. But I would throw a third recommendation there, and someone who is, and it's a book, and this is a book that is not by Dostoevsky, and it's not by Tolstoy. It's by Mikhail Bulgakov, and that is The Master and Margarita. This is a funny book. It's a quick read. I want to say maybe 400, less than 500 pages, certainly. So easier to read than most of Dostoevsky or Tolstoy. And I think that this gives you a different spin on Russian literature. I think the Russians are often thought of as very dour and very serious, but the truth is Russians can be very, very funny as well, and Bulgakov is just one of those writers who it's going to really drive the point home about the humor. Dostoevsky, of course, is funny. I've mentioned this before, and in fact, Nabokov actually in some assessments of writers, he mentions Dostoevsky and basically says that Dostoevsky is just pure slapstick, and for that reason he doesn't like Dostoevsky all that much. So Dostoevsky was funny. We can argue about whether or not that was a good thing, but Bulgakov is also funny, and he's doing it to great effect in The Master of Margarita. Here's a request from L. L is one of our supporters over on our Substack at theclassicalmind.com, so thank you very much, L. L asked actually for 2 different recommendations, and I'm going to try to help her out here. The first was just, how do you get into poetry and how do you start reading it? This is actually very hard for me. There are some poets that I like. There are some poets that I like very, very much. But poetry in general is a lot harder for me to appreciate than most literature, than philosophy, than theology, reading history, something like this. Poetry is just the thing that I've often struggled with. So let's just think about classic and accessible. And if I'm thinking about classic and accessible poets, especially for people who would be watching this or asking, I think L is an American as well. Let's just look at American poets, right? I think Walt Whitman, you should just get Leaves of Grass and read through it. I've read through a lot of that. I read through some of it as like a little fun thing to do with my wife for a little while, and that is really, really great. Emily Dickinson, someone I talk about here a lot. I really like Ezra Pound's poetry. Ezra Pound is a complicated figure, and we don't have to go into that here, but I really like his poetry. Also, just kind of to maybe throw a slight curveball, the Psalms from the Bible are the foundational poetic text for much of the great books and the classics. Familiarity with the Psalms, and I would say probably just either using the Coverdale translation that was found in the Book of Common Prayer because that became so widespread, or the Psalms that you would find in the King James Version of the Bible. Those, not even considering them as religious text, and I would have things to say about them as religious text, but just considering them as works of poetry, arguably the most important work of poetry that's maybe ever existed, but certainly if we're just looking at its impact on the literary world, then they have been huge, and I think it's a very easy argument to make. So read Emily Dickinson, read Walt Whitman, read Ezra Pound, and then read the Psalms, and I think you're going to find something in there that you'd like. Another request from Elle, though, was about medieval classics to read with a middle schooler. This is tough. Middle schoolers are very, very tough. It's just a tough demographic to please. And also, this is when a lot of individuality is being formed. And so finding a recommendation for a middle schooler in general is a little tough. But I do have one main suggestion, kind of on a theme, and then we can talk a little bit about it. I really, really like The Once and Future King by T.H. White. That is not from the medieval world, but it is a retelling of Thomas Mallory's adaptation of the legends of King Arthur. The stories of Arthurian legend are something that I really, really love. And T.H. White's tellings are interesting adaptations of Mallory. They are a bit more modern, and I think it would be easier to read. The early parts of The Once and Future King can be quite funny, and so that helps a lot too. There are humorous bits throughout the rest, but it does get more and more serious, especially once Mordred is introduced. So you could either read The Once and Future King, or you could try to read Le Mort d'Arthur, right? The Death of Arthur. My French is terrible, so forgive me. But reading Thomas Mallory might be the way to go as well, depending on your middle schooler. One suggestion for anyone trying to introduce their middle schoolers or even their elementary school students to these myths or medieval classics or anything like this, anything that would fall under the category of mythology, pick up a copy of Bulfinch's Mythology. Bulfinch's Mythology is not something you just start from the beginning and read through. It's more of a reference work. But I just have this kind of image of this work kind of sitting out on the table or just sitting on a shelf, and the curious child will find it and flip through it and eventually find something that they fall in love with. There are other sources of mythology, though, that you could be reading too. You could read the Prose Edda. There are translations of that easily available, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight as well. I think stories of heroism are probably going to be easier for a middle schooler rather than reading something like the Divine Comedy. But you should experiment a lot. I think what you're trying to do, though, Elle, I think this is really good stuff. You're starting this middle schooler on hopefully just a life of reading the classics, and what a great gift to give them. So Veronica asked for science fiction recommendations, but she had two conditions. One of them was that it couldn't be the kind of science fiction that can veer into fantasy, and the other was that she didn't want anything post apocalyptic. Let's talk about that second condition for a second. When you start thinking about it, a lot of science fiction has post apocalyptic elements to it. So I don't want to totally bar any story with a post apocalyptic element. Um, Please forgive me, Veronica. But I do know that there are certain stories that are heavily post apocalyptic, and I will avoid anything like that. So here are a couple of recommendations that I hope will fit the bill. One of them, with absolutely no post apocalyptic elements at all, is The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell. It's a first context story. It has some interesting religious themes, though I think anybody could read it and they would enjoy it. It is a story about guilt. It's a story about the differences in cultures. It's about unintended consequences. A great little book. And so that one might be something to look into. And it's a book that I've just found not enough people know about. A second book that I would recommend is anything by Xijin Liu. The Three Body Problem begins a trilogy. Without getting into too many spoilers, I should just say that if you're into first context stories, if you're into extended time periods, if you are into going through several different characters over the course of a series, then you will probably like this. It's deeply philosophical, it's political, it's scientific, it's just good. It's just everything I want science fiction to be. Can be found in that trilogy. Finally, I would recommend anything by Neal Stephenson. I love Neal Stephenson. I recently read Seven Eves, and Seven Eves has a post-apocalyptic kind of thing to it, depending on how you define apocalypse. And that's actually the problem, right? It's very, very hard to define what an apocalypse is for the purposes of this kind of recommendation. But anyway, Stevenson is great. Seven Eves is great. You could also read Snow Crash, or you could read Anathema, which is a book that I have recommended multiple times and I think is great. And there's almost kind of something you could call post-apocalyptic about that story. I think that would be stretching the definition of post-apocalyptic, though, so I feel fine recommending that book and pretty much anything by Neal Stephenson. Also, I would call attention to Dawn, which begins the trilogy of Lilith's Brood by Octavia Butler. Ursula K. Le Guin's work probably fits the bill for a lot of this stuff. No real apocalypses in something like The Dispossessed. Also, I recently read Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time, and I really, really liked it. One thing is that there's just like a lot of spiders in that book, and I am afraid of spiders, but I was still able to enjoy it. And again, no real. Again, though, that's a book where you might say that there's like an apocalyptic element, but just because it's not a focus of the story. But man, so much of science fiction relies on something like this, especially modern science fiction. I guess you could just say most writers of science fiction just do not think humanity is going to make it in its present form, and they're very pessimistic, and that's just reflected in the stuff that they write. Request that came from Jacob, who again is one of our supporters over on Substack. He said that basically he's had trouble reading fiction for a while, and he wants to get into something that's highly immersive because he's been reading a lot of nonfiction lately. And we had several people write something similar. A few people asked for books to just kickstart that love of reading, help you out as you pursue reading as a hobby. The problem with these, I'll just say, is that everyone's going to be a little bit different here, and it's just going to be finding that book that sort of sparks your interest. I would recommend that you check out a video I've done before called 4 Books That Made Me Love Reading Again. Those helped me a lot. I don't know if they would help you. If I could think off the top of my head, maybe not for Jacob. I actually know Jacob kind of personally, but for other people, if you're like just getting into reading and you're just like looking for something fun, I know so many people who read Ender's Game and just devoured that book. It's easy to read. You could read it in 2 days, even though it's really kind of thick, but it's really hard to put down. Very compelling book, and it might get you into reading science fiction, right? And if reading is just becoming your hobby, then like what a great thing to do. Another suggestion for this, though, would be just go and find like a list of like the 100 classics or something, like the 100 greatest books of all time or something like that, right? And those lists are like a little silly, but odds are most of the books that are on the list are pretty good. So you could go and look at those lists and then just see, does anything strike your fancy, right? And if it does, just pick it up and try to read it. If you are easing yourself back into reading, maybe go for something a little bit shorter. Look for something that has got like a really good hook to it. Um, Maybe The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway would be something to check out if you want to read more American literature. 1984 by George Orwell is very engaging and I think is a fairly straightforward read, except for like this political treatise in the middle of it. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley also would be a great book to read if you are kind of in this camp. Kind of science fiction-y, but clearly a classic of literary fiction as well, an important book to read. I'm not going to attribute this request to any one person because enough people asked about it. They asked for sort of philosophically oriented books. And they were looking for novels, it seemed. And there are a couple of names that I'll just rattle off that you could sort of start your journey with. You should read Dostoevsky. You should read Camus. You should look into Calvino. Calvino is not really an existentialist, but he's going to kind of get you in this surrealism or something like this. Maybe you'll like magical realism. I don't know. It just feels right. Also, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And then maybe check out Borges as well. That was the end of the list that I'd compiled, but I'm just pulling up my phone right now, and we're going to pick one more. I'm looking through my YouTube comments right now, which is never the healthiest thing to do. Oh, okay. Here is someone who just said that they are a medical student, and they are trying to broaden their worldview with the humanities. Where should you start? Start with the best. Start with the ones that everyone would name, because if you haven't read them, you should just correct that. I'm going to mostly stick with English language suggestions here, but I would just say read Shakespeare, read a little bit of Chaucer. You don't have to read the entire Canterbury Tales if you don't want to. But also, if you're looking for someone who can write really great characters, Jane Austen. Just read Jane Austen. Everyone should read Jane Austen. This should be the takeaway from the entire video. Read good stuff, and everyone just go and read Jane Austen. All right, that was short, so I think we can do maybe one more. Here's a good one because it's not fiction. Someone asked me, because of my background in analytic philosophy, they asked about books that could be in the realm of logic, philosophy of language, philosophy of science, or philosophy of religion. And it turns out I have some interest in almost all of this. So let me suggest a few works here. Wittgenstein's work on philosophy of language is foundational and important, though I went through most of my PhD barely talking about Wittgenstein, to be honest. The Tractatus, or Philosophical Investigations, probably something worth reading. If you want to think about philosophy of language with a mix of epistemology and a few other things, Robert Stalnacker's work in Inquiry that's an astounding little book. I also highly recommend the work of David Lewis. If you're talking about philosophy of language and metaphysics and logic, he couldn't really separate any of those. If you were looking for philosophy of religion, I don't know of philosophers of religion whose work I think is like truly excellent. In part, this is because I have some stronger opinions about some of this stuff, so that's a little bit harder for me, and I haven't spent enough time with it to really know what's truly great. Alvin Plantinga is a name that's going to get bandied about quite a bit. Some of his metaphysical stuff is very interesting. William Alston is someone else who I would maybe recommend. Both of them were part of this movement of reformed epistemology, which is very interesting because William Alston was not reformed with a big R in the denominational sense, but it got labeled that way because of Plantinga. There's a really cool book by a philosopher named Nicholas Wolterstorff, and it's actually a work of theology, but he's using almost some stuff that you would get from philosophy of language, and he is a trained philosopher, to talk about like liturgy and liturgical worship. Maybe that would also be interesting for you. This is already going to be a pretty long video. I hope I've given you some interesting recommendations. If I didn't get to yours, I apologize again. Maybe we'll be able to in a future video. All right, that's all I have for you today, so take care.